Most of the sentences we've worked with so far in this course have been, in grammatical terms, loose sentences. That means that they complete the basic pattern of subject and predicate early on, keeping subject and verb near the beginning of the sentence and keeping subject and verb close together. Most cumulative sentences are forms of loose syntax, quickly positing an initial base clause, then adding to it, detailing it, clarifying it, and following modifying phrases. A sentence is considered loose no matter how long it is or how complex it is if it front-loads its subject and verb. At least in grammatical terms, the opposite of a loose sentence is a periodic sentence. Whereas the loose sentence wants to deliver its basic subject and verb information quickly, the periodic sentence wants to do just the opposite, delaying or suspending the completion of its subject-verb clause until the very end of the sentence. So, in grammatical terms, sentences fall into just two main categories: sentences that are loose, putting the subject and verb near the beginning of the sentence, and sentences that are periodic, delaying the unfolding of the sentence's most important news until its very end, demanding the reader's close attention, sometimes to the very last word. Consider Midwesterner Nick Carraway's description of the East in The Great Gatsby. Quote, "Even when the East excited me most, even when I was most keenly aware of its superiority to the bored, sprawling, swollen towns beyond the Ohio, with their interminable inquisitions which spared only the children and the very old, even then it had always for me a quality of..." Distortion is the word with which Nick ends his sentence. And until we get to that word, we really have no clear idea where his sentence is going. The East could have had a quality of lots of things for Nick: despair, unreality, sadness, pessimism, boredom, or any of an unlimited number of other negative descriptors. But it is only when we fill in that final blank with distortion that we fully comprehend what Nick is telling us. That's a classic periodic sentence. Even when the East excited me most, even when I was most keenly aware of its superiority to the bored, sprawling, swollen towns beyond the Ohio with their interminable inquisitions, which spared only the children and the very old, even then it had always for me a quality of distortion. And it's a really memorable, really emphatic sentence. It is striking, as indeed many periodic sentences are. And the periodic sentence seems particularly useful in philosophical discourse, where if-then constructions are frequently found, arguing that the universe is not what I choose that it should be. Bertrand Russell explains, quote, "If it is indifferent to human desires, as it seems to be, if human life is a passing episode hardly noticeable in the vastness of cosmic processes, if there is no superhuman purpose and no hope of ultimate salvation, it is better to know and acknowledge this truth than to endeavor in futile self-assertion to order the universe to be what we find comfortable." End of quote. But before we start looking at some of the many other neat things periodic sentences can do, let's return for a moment to that idea that sentences fall into two main grammatical categories, the loose and the periodic. Now, if the terminology we have inherited for talking about sentences made any sense at all, the opposite of the loose sentence would be the tight sentence, not the periodic. And thinking of sentences as loose and tight would make it easier for us to decide which kind we prefer, with both terms having their positive and their negative connotations. But grammatical terminology immediately starts stacking the deck against loose syntax when its opposite is not tight, but is periodic syntax. Even if we have no idea what periodic means, it sounds more formal, more businesslike, more impressive than loose. And that's exactly the way most writing guides over the years have constructed this opposition, with loose sentences being equated with, or at least associated with, simple or simplistic expression, and periodic sentences not just associated with, but equated with, more sophisticated, more complex thinking. Accordingly, many writing texts up until the past few years have strongly implied, if they have not openly prescribed, that writers should aspire to the formal maturity of the periodic sentence. Number 18 of Professor Strunk's principles of composition in The Elements of Style is avoid a succession of loose sentences. Now, surprisingly enough, Professor Strunk did acknowledge that a writer could also err by using too many periodic sentences. He explained, quote, "An occasional loose sentence prevents the style from becoming too formal and gives the reader a certain relief," end of quote. However, there's no mistaking the put-down in his description of loose sentences as, quote, "common and easy unstudied writing," end of quote. And in his dismissal that, quote, "an unskilled writer will sometimes construct a whole paragraph of sentences of this kind," end of quote. Later, in Professor Strunk's 22nd principle of composition, he explains that the, quote, "effectiveness of the periodic sentence arises from the prominence it gives the main statement," end of quote, by placing it at the end of the sentence. He offers as an example, 4 centuries ago, Christopher Columbus, one of the Italian mariners whom the decline of their own republics had put at the service of the world and of adventure, seeking for Spain a westward passage to the Indies to offset the achievement of Portuguese discoverers, lighted on America. We all know where Columbus ended up, but we're not sure where that sentence is going to end until we come to its very last word. The main statement or base clause of the sentence is, Christopher Columbus lighted on America. But before we get to complete that thought, we're led on a rambling detour through the history of decline of Italy, through Spain's desire for a westward passage to the Indies, and a reminder that mariners from Portugal were then on a roll. In his portion of The Elements of Style, E.B. White doesn't join Professor Strunk in warning against loose sentences, but in this noteworthy sentence from Stuart Little, he certainly reveals his interest in periodic technique, and he reminds us both that the periodic sentence does not have to be overly complex, and that the suspense it builds by delaying the completion of its message may ultimately be, in fact, quite anticlimactic. Here's the quote. "In the loveliest town of all, where the houses were white and high, and the elm trees were green and higher than the houses, where the front yards were wide and pleasant, and the backyards were bushy and worth finding out about, where the streets sloped down to the stream, and the stream flowed quietly under the bridge, where the lawns ended in orchards, and the orchards ended in fields, and the fields ended in pastures, and the pastures climbed the hill and disappeared over the top toward the wonderful wide sky. In this loveliest of all towns, Stuart stopped to get a drink of sarsaparilla." In a negatively prescriptive vein, similar to that adopted by Professor Strunk, my old Harbrace College Handbook, the 7th edition, urges the writer to, quote, "gain emphasis by changing loose sentences into periodic sentences," end of quote. Apparently, the problem with the loose sentence is that, quote, "it can be easily scanned since the main idea comes toward the beginning," end of quote, while, quote, "to get the meaning of a periodic sentence, however, the reader cannot stop until he reaches the period, end of quote. Note how both Strunk and White and the Harbrace Handbook turn up their noses at writing that is easy or easily scanned, as if difficulty of comprehension were somehow a virtue in writing. This is one of the bits of uncritically received writing wisdom against which Francis Christensen championed the cumulative syntax, although, as we are about to see, the dichotomy long perceived between loose and periodic sentences is largely a false one. In subsequent lectures, we will look at the wide range of strategies that can produce periodic sentences, and we'll consider some of the situations in which periodic sentences can be most effective. For the moment, however, I want to consider the history of this term. Then I want to complicate the binary opposition between loose and periodic sentences by demonstrating that sentences take their place in a continuum of delay and can best be thought of not as types, but in terms of their degree of suspensiveness. Thinking of degrees of suspense in our writing gives us much greater control over our sentences than does thinking of a kind of sentence that is loose and is the opposite of a kind of sentence that is periodic. As almost any history of rhetoric will note, the word period comes from the Greek term periodos, which had to do with cycles or coming back to or going around in a circle. Aristotle in particular stressed the recurrent or reflexive nature of the periodic style as a style, quote, that turns back upon itself, end of quote, citing as examples, quote, the antistrophes of the old poets, end of quote, and even more strongly suggesting that a period offered an antithetical opposition, such as we see in these examples from Aristotle. They benefited both those who had remained at home and those who had followed them. To the latter, they secured more land than they had possessed at home. To the former, they left land at home, which was now adequate. As Aristotle helpfully catalogs the antitheses or oppositions in this sentence, those who remained at home are opposed or balanced by those who had followed them. To the latter is opposed by to the former. Land they had possessed is opposed by left land at home. More land is opposed by adequate, and so on. Here's another example, several more examples actually from Aristotle. It often happens in such cases that the wise fail and the fools succeed. Here's another. Though citizens by birth, they were by law deprived of citizenship. And finally, as individuals we use barbarians as our servants. As citizens we tolerate many of our allies being enslaved. For Aristotle then, a periodic sentence was characterized by some form of turning about, either through opposition of contrasting ideas or repetition, techniques which will delay our apprehension of the full meaning of the sentence until it has completed its turn or made clear its internal oppositions. But missing from Aristotle's view was the emphasis on interruption or delay that we now associate with periodic form. And also missing is the close association identified by George A. Kennedy in his A New History of Classical Rhetoric between periodic style and, quote, writing in long, complex sentences not easily understood when first heard, end of quote. As Matthew Clark points out in his 2002 study, A Matter of Style, this identification of the periodic with antithesis, or with what we now think of as balanced form, seems peculiar to Aristotle since, quote, in later rhetorical theory, a period is a long sentence that uses grammatical subordination, especially to create some sort of suspense of meaning, end of quote. And all experts agree that the great classical master of the periodic sentence and of periodic style was the Roman orator Cicero. Ciceronian style is periodic style, as we understand the term today, particularly as it suggests delay, building to a dramatic conclusion at the end of the sentence. Now, I'm with Richard Lanham, who in some exasperation notes that periodic is one of those traditional but confusing terms we ought to throw away but can't. As he discusses in his second edition of Analyzing Prose, Lanham reminds us that Aristotle referred to what we now call loose sentences as strung along sentences or as running sentences. Now, the latter term actually seems to make more sense than loose, since it suggests a sentence that just goes on with no clear destination in sight unless and until the subject matter runs out, as opposed to the period, which has to end just so. Lanham finds fault with both of the terms we have for describing sentences, finding running not much more helpful than periodic. However, he notes that these terms do refer to different conceptual processes, a basic difference in how one human intelligence presents itself to another, if not to rigorously identifiable grammatical forms. To imitate the mind in real-time interaction with the world is to write in some form of running style, he suggests, explaining, quote, such a syntax models the mind in the act of coping with the world, end of quote. Conversely, the periodic style dramatizes, quote, a mind which has dominated experience and reworked it to its liking, the mind showing itself after it has reasoned on the event, after it has sorted by concept and categorized by size, after it has imposed on the temporal flow the shapes through which that flow takes on a beginning, a middle, and an end, end of quote. Now, if there seems to be an ideological ring to this description of the difference between loose and periodic sentences, an almost imperial imperative in which the writer is called upon to impose firm order on a messy world, Lanham quickly disavows that implication, reminding us that, quote, to go with the flow is as human as to oppose it, that humankind's bewilderment before a raw event is as characteristic as the will to impose order on it, end of quote. And you thought the difference between a loose and a periodic sentence was just a matter of where the base clause completes itself. In historical terms, Lanham reminds us that at the end of the Renaissance, which he dates from about 1575, quote, a reaction set in against periodic structure as the ideal sentence shape. The call, under the banner of science, was for a new prose style that would more accurately reflect the world as it really was, not as it had been stuffed into the orderly and balanced mini-drama of the periodic sentence, end of quote. In some ways, that revolution against the periodic style at the end of the Renaissance was only a mixed success, since while most writing guidebooks today do warn against unrelieved strings of periodic sentences, they still suggest that the periodic sentence is what aspiring writers should try to write. What I've been trying to show thus far in this lecture is the somewhat odd history on which that advice rests. And what I'll try to do in the remainder of this lecture is to further question the bias in favor of periodic sentences by suggesting that the chasm we've been told exists between loose and periodic sentences is not nearly as wide as we have been led to believe. Once again, Richard Lanham, one of the true original thinkers in rhetorical and composition theory, reached this conclusion well before I did. Lanham ends the chapter on the periodic style and the running style in his 2003 second edition of Analyzing Prose with an acknowledgement that undercuts years of claims that periodic syntax was the true mark of a sophisticated writer. Quote, "We can reason that the periodic style, like the noun style, shows thought to be static, organized into its component parts, and then flash frozen. The running style, like the verb style, shows behavior still in progress, happening in the present, not the past. The contrast often proves a fruitful one, but it ought not to lead us to ignore the powerful internal dynamics the period can generate. If you add enough internal qualifications and parenthetical interruptions, it turns into a running style. The running style seems more naturally to represent the moody reflections of the private life. If, however, it is pervaded by a need for compound pairing and balance, for syntactic regularity, it takes a turn toward the periodic, and even in spots toward antithetical compression or point. Clearly, periodic and running are two defining extremes within which the need to express action and stasis, emotion and concept, compression and expansion finds many answerable prose patterns." End of quote. I'm giving so much prominence to Lanham because I want to seriously question, if not to deconstruct, the classic binary opposition between what Lanham identifies as running and periodic sentences, or what is most frequently described as the opposition between loose and periodic syntax. Francis Christensen has helped us challenge this opposition with his theory of the cumulative sentence, which introduces us to one particular kind of loose sentence that grows progressively tighter, or more like the periodic sentence, as it generates parallels, balances, even antitheses in its modifying phrases. And one of the implications I want to avoid in this course is that by starting the course with a focus on cumulative sentences and then moving on to periodic syntax, I am in any way suggesting that the latter somehow represents an advance over, or refinement of, or greater degree of sophistication than the former. Indeed, I began this course with a focus on the cumulative syntax because it can provide a foundation for thinking about periodic sentences, while the reverse is simply not true. Nor do I want to suggest that the cumulative is somehow a superior syntax to be preferred over the periodic. My goal is to strip away several centuries of bias in favor of the periodic, to celebrate these two syntaxes for their respective glories, without claiming that one shines more brightly than does the other. In this effort, I think time is on my side, but the grip of the ancient and antique in rhetoric and composition theory is always difficult to overcome. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of books about writing gathering dust on library shelves throughout the land, and most of these books draw their examples of exemplary sentences from centuries not only before the 21st, but from before the 20th as well. I can't begin to prove it, but I bet that a good 75% to 85% of the examples of fine writing or distinguished prose in all the writing books that have been published are examples of periodic style, with most of those examples drawn from writers who lived before the 19th century. Whatever the figure, my point is that one of the important steps we need to take in order to make our writing more effective is to counteract the tons of bad, or at least of misleading advice that has been faithfully and uncritically passed down to us through the ages. Cicero may have been the great master of periodic style, but the fact is, few of us want to write like Cicero. With that said, let's look at some specific ways in which the grammatical distinction between cumulative and periodic sentences begins to break down. Only to move us another step away from the inherited bias in favor of periodic sentences, I'm also going to stop using the term periodic itself, substituting for it suspensive. There's no difference, really, since underlying both terms is the same aesthetic of delay, but periodic comes to us surrounded by connotations of length, complexity, and difficulty, whereas suspensive has a connotative clean slate, only suggesting that the syntax builds suspense or suspends completion of the sentence's message to a greater or lesser degree. Suspensive sentences are the Hamlets of the writing world. And indeed, one of my favorite suspensive sentences comes from Hamlet himself. To be or not to be, that is the question. And under the sign of delaying tactics, one of my all-time favorite suspensive sentences was written by one of my students years ago and says quite simply, I was perhaps stalling. In earlier lectures, I've already offered several examples of grammatically cumulative sentences that functioned suspensively. There was the corpse in the trunk sentence. He drove the car, his shaggy hair whipped by the wind, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his mouth set in a grim smile, a .38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk. And I absolutely promise that is the last time I'll make you listen to that particular sentence. There was also the boy sitting down to eat sentence, which is also grammatically cumulative, but which so delays the base clause by left-branching modifiers that it functions suspensively. Rubbing his hands together, running his hungry eyes over the steaming food, anticipating the feast, savoring its aromas, stunned by his good fortune, realizing an opportunity like this might never come again, he sat down. Let's take another example of a left-branching cumulative sentence that delivers the goods like a suspensive sentence to remind ourselves that suspense is always a matter of degree. Having sharpened all of my pencils and lined them up together at least twice, having neatly placed beside my pencils a brand new yellow legal pad, having visited the bathroom for the third time in the past 20 minutes, having reminded myself that I now compose exclusively on the computer and not with pencil on yellow legal pad, having checked my email one final time just to be sure there wasn't a note waiting for me from the MacArthur Foundation, having cranked up my iTunes Basil Polidorus soundtrack from Conan the Barbarian as loud as it would go, having done a final few deep knee bends, having drained my fourth cup of coffee, probably the reason for that third bathroom visit, desperately hoping that this time the magic would work, I sat down at my computer, ready to write. That's a left-branching suspensive version of what could have been a right-branching cumulative sentence or loose sentence that would have read, I sat down at my computer ready to write, having sharpened all of my pencils and lined them up together at least twice, having neatly placed beside my pencils a brand new yellow legal pad, having visited the bathroom for the third time in the past 20 minutes, having reminded myself that I now compose exclusively on the computer and not with pencil on yellow legal pad, having checked my email one final time just to be sure there wasn't a note waiting for me from the MacArthur Foundation, having cranked up my iTunes Basil Polidorus soundtrack from Conan the Barbarian as loud as it would go, having done a final few deep knee bends, having drained my fourth cup of coffee, probably the reason for that third bathroom visit, desperately hoping that this time the magic would work. And, of course, I could reposition that base clause, I sat down at my computer, or its extended version, I sat down at my computer ready to write, after any of those modifying phrases. For instance, if the base clause is moved roughly to the middle of this sentence, we get, having sharpened all of my pencils and lined them up together at least twice, having neatly placed beside my pencils a brand new yellow legal pad, having visited the bathroom for the third time in the past 20 minutes, having reminded myself that I now compose exclusively on the computer and not with pencil on yellow legal pad, having checked my email one final time just to be sure there wasn't a note waiting for me from the MacArthur Foundation, I sat down at my computer ready to write, having cranked up my iTunes Basil Polidorus soundtrack from Conan the Barbarian as loud as it would go, having done a final few deep knee bends, having drained my fourth cup of coffee, probably the reason for that third bathroom visit, desperately hoping that this time the magic would work. Winston Weathers and Otis Winchester explore this idea of degrees of suspensiveness. Of course, they insist on calling it degrees of periodicity. And there, the strategy of style, starting with the sentence, "Red-tailed hawks hunt my meadow," then expanding it to, "On those sheet metal days in February, red-tailed hawks hunt my meadow for rabbits and field mice." Next, they make it somewhat more periodic. "On those sheet metal days in February when the rabbits and field mice creep out to feed red-tailed hawks hunt my meadow." And finally, they make the sentence almost wholly periodic. "Hunting my meadow for rabbits and field mice on those sheet metal days in February was a pair of red-tailed hawks." The point of their variations and of mine is simply to remind us that any sentence can be made more or less suspensive, and rather than think of the long-standing but essentially misleading dichotomy between loose and periodic sentences, it may reward the writer to think of suspensiveness as a continuum along which sentences fall. The more we are aware of this continuum, and the more we master the sentence structures that constitute it, the more effective our writing will become.